Okay, this is the final video for the Big Raven painting. And now we're going to apply watercolor in the background. So thus far, we've added oil pastel throughout. And for the background, I'm going to start in this small area right here. So I'm just getting plain water on my brush. I'm just going to paint this area with just normal clear water. And then using my watercolor palette, I'm going to pick up a little bit of yellow orange. So I have a wet brush. I'm just kind of swirling it around to get some of that color. And I'm just going to apply this color right here. So we're using the wet on wet technique. And so this creates a very light watercolor effect. Now, if you accidentally get this area a little too dark, so right now mine's pretty bright, I'm going to take a paper towel and just press. Don't wipe, but just press down, straight down. And then when you lift up, it'll automatically lighten that color, so it isn't nearly as bright or dark. So just a little trick you can use just in case you run into that. So I'm going to go ahead and paint this area with plain water. And once you get close to the trees, you may want to just kind of slow down just a little bit. And remember, hold your brush on the metal. You'll have a lot more control. And the reason you want to be careful is that you may pick up some of the oil pastel from the trees or even the rocks below. And what that would do, it would drag some of those greens or blues or grays into the sky area. So now I'm going to get my yellow orange again, just swirl this around. We're just going to dab in this color. Move the yellow orange around in this background. And I want this to match pretty closely to what's right here. So you can see this is pretty light compared to what I'm painting right now. So I'm going to use my paper towel technique again. And this paper towel technique can also simulate clouds if you just press down in like certain areas. So for example, if I just press like part of this, kind of lightens up some spots and it looks like there's clouds in the background. But for this, I'm just going to go ahead and press over the whole thing. So it makes it a little more even. Right, so now the top and bottom have about the same value. And we'll just do the last part. So again, just using plain water. And I'll get my yellow orange one last time. that area is a lot darker, so I'll definitely want to press right there. But I'm just going to kind of move some of this other color to other parts. So it evens out. So when I press down. So now I'm going to get my paper towel. Just again, just press straight down. Make sure you don't kind of swipe at it or wipe it. All right, so now I have a very light yellow-orange background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait for this to dry for just a little bit, and we're going to look at how to fill in all these tiny little white spaces where we've added oil pastel. So there's a couple ways you can do this. So if you use the water-soluble oil pastels, you can really just use plain water to paint back over this, or to paint back over your oil pastel areas, and it'll move some of that oil pastel around and fill in some of those white spaces. Now you can also use paint, in this case your watercolor paint, to paint in these spaces too. So if you use non-soluble oil pastels, this is maybe a technique that you'll want to do. So if I get a little bit of my blue, I can go in and paint back over some of these areas. And where there's oil pastel, the oil pastel will reject my watercolor paint. But where I have those little small gaps of white paper, the watercolor paint will seep into those holes and it'll fill it in with color. So it looks more solid. So I'm just using my regular blue and painting over it. And you can see it's not really covering up my light blue areas or my highlights. So I'm going to use a light blue for right here. Just touch up some of these spots. So this will really help give the painting a more finished look to it. And so while I'm doing this will, give me enough time for my background to dry a little more thoroughly. So a lot of white in this lower corner, so I've got to make sure to paint over that. So again, if you're using the non-water soluble oil pastels, plain water won't blend the watercolor or won't blend the pastel stuff. So you may have to use this technique where you're using watercolor paint to go on top of it. And you may have done something like this before in like elementary school. It's called crayon resist, where you draw with crayons and then you paint with watercolor paint. And it does the same thing. It'll like fill in some of these little white gaps in the paper. So that's starting to look better. And let me get a little bit of my yellow green. Just drop some of this over here. And notice when I'm painting, I'm still trying to go in the same direction when I put my oil pastels down in the first place. So when all this watercolor dries, the water evaporates and the watercolor pigment will seep into those holes, or the little gaps that you may have. Now in the areas where we have gray, so for example, in here, got some over here, you can really use pretty much any color as long as you put it down kind of light. Oops. I definitely would not use black. If you want to mix up a gray, you can. So if I take a little bit of black, mix it with this white, we get a gray out of that. So you can even make it gray. So I'm just going to paint this gray on top of the gray areas really quick. So that way it keeps the entire look pretty consistent. Put a little yellow green on top of the wing, kind of fill in some of those small spaces. So by taking the time to use this effect or this technique, it really helps kind of finish out your watercolor painting. We're getting more solid blocks of color, just looks more finished, has a very painted or painterly look to it. Add some more gray down here. Okay, so I'm going to keep adding a little bit of gray. I'm also going to just drop in some blue violet, kind of mix it with some of these grays just to give it a little more color so it's not so neutral and dull. Even touch up this area, the back side of the wing with some violet or blue violet. Just carefully going over some of my outlines also. Got outside my line a little bit. Which it's not that big of a deal because the background will eventually turn kind of dark. So I'm not too worried about that. All right, so I'm just going to touch up a few areas, mostly along here and down here, and then we'll look at the background sky. All right, so I'm going to get a little more blue violet, or light blue rather, and push this in over here where some of these gaps are. And go right under the base of the sculpture. So most of your like kind of white gaps in the paper, or they're mostly going to be close to where you have changes in color. So for example, like from the mountain to the base, I had a little bit of a white space where I'd stopped. You know, there's some white spaces here, like where I had put flowers, but they also start to touch the mountain base. So most likely that's where you're going to have most of these white gaps. Got some areas over here where the blue changes into the green. So I'm allowing some of this green to overlap into the blue just a little bit. Adding a little more light blue down here, but it's pretty watery, so it's not going to really change the colors too much. Just going to bring that line back. I think I'll do it over here too. All right, let's check the background. Okay, so this is pretty dry now. It's still a little damp, but it's dry enough for me to add the oil pastels. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use 3 colors. I'm going to use my regular gray or light gray. I'm also going to use my slate gray. It's that darker gray that almost looks blue. And then lastly, I'm going to use my regular blue. I can find it. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're really going to mimic the storm clouds and how we see these in the original painting. So with my blue, let's actually grab my blue violet because I don't know where my blue is. Oh, there it is. Okay, so with my blue, I'm just going to set some of this blue in the corners. And I'm not going to press super hard. And what I'm doing, I'm really just working in these kind of curving, arcing hatch lines. So I'm really not pressing hard at all. I'm just kind of dragging the oil pastel across the paper. Put some over here. I'm going to go in this direction now. And so the direction and the lines that you're adding this oil pastel, this is going to be important because that'll help guide your paintbrush. All right, so that's all regular blue. Now I'm going to switch to my slate gray. It's that darker gray color. And right where I left off with the blue, I'm going to pick up with the slate gray. And I want to keep using these kind of curving, arcing motions with my oil pastels. But again, we don't want to press real hard. So I'm curving these around the bird's head. And I'm going to do one mark right there. Do a little bit in the corner up here. And then lastly, with my light gray, just going to go over some of these areas. So we're really not going to see too much of that yellow orange that's left. Really only going to see it near the bottom. Now there is some like kind of light marks right here. Maybe one right here. And then we'll just kind of fill in these spaces really lightly. All right. So this is where you definitely have to have the water soluble oil pastels. So what that'll mean is that when I use water on a brush, it'll blend these colors. Now, I don't want a lot of water on my brush. So when I get water on my brush, I'm going to try and just scrape off some of the excess. That way, when I paint over these, I'll still have a little bit of texture to my brush, and it will help break up these pastel marks, but it'll still leave kind of a nice, like almost like scratchy, rough appearance. So like I said, we want to paint our water on in the direction that you set down your oil pastel. So that way it's consistent. So I started curving them this direction, curve this way. And so as you're doing this, just be real careful not to drag a whole lot of water onto your other areas with oil pastel, because you'll lose those colors and then they'll start to kind of bleed into your sky area. So most of this yellow-orange background, at least at the top of the painting, will get covered up, or the color will just change a little bit. So like along the mountaintop, you can see the color has started to get away from that yellow-orange, and it's starting to turn a little more gray because of the light gray I put down. So again, you want to be real careful around these trees. So hold your brush on the metal part of the paintbrush, and that'll give you a lot more control. And so this is the only area of the painting that we'll use this technique, where we're just watercoloring, kind of a basic color, letting it dry, then going over it with oil pastels, and then reblending the oil pastels. So I have these small areas of gray that I kind of swiped near the bottom. So I'm just going to go over those and then just kind of fade those into the yellow orange. And that's really the only area that I'll paint right there. You can see a little more of that texture. Just touch up this stuff. And then if you get areas that are maybe a little too light, or they just didn't really turn out how you like. So for example, I like to get this area in here a little more blue. So I've already painted over this. It is still damp. It's not soaking wet, but I can use my oil pastel. Go over that section again. You can see it really push that blue color more. And because this paper is still damp, the oil pastel was kind of trying to blend into the paper, but it needs a little bit of help. So if I use my brush, still has a little bit of water on it, I can just go back over this area. Now you definitely want to make sure your brush does not have a lot of water on it, because then your paper may start to disintegrate. Because right now this area is We just don't want to overload it with too much water. So you can really repeat this process as often as you need to, as long as your paper just doesn't get too wet. So if you start to notice the paper flaking, not small watercolor or not small oil pastel chunks, but actual paper chunks, you need to stop and let the paper fully dry. Otherwise, it's at risk of tearing or just having a big hole show up. So you do have to be a little careful. And last thing, I think I'm just going to emphasize this gray area a bit more, maybe with my slate gray a little bit and the light gray. Just go over this. Maybe just a little bit right here. So I'm going to redo those lower areas. There, now that's starting to show up better. And last thing, I just want to clean up this line right here. It looks just kind of chunky. It's got a lot of white spots in it. So with my paintbrush and a little bit of water, I'm just going to go over that and try and smooth it out a bit. I may just get a little bit of violet watercolor on my brush and then go back over it. There, that looks better. And then when you're finished, we'll zoom out just a bit. We'll pull our tape. So remember to peel the top layer first. So this is my top layer. Pull it away from the painted part and keep it low, so don't pull straight up. And even though we were using oil pastel and watercolor, we get this super sharp, nice line out of it. Here, we'll zoom back in. So it just looks really nice. So we'll peel these other layers of tape. And really the last thing I'll need to do is erase where I have those pencil marks in the corner. So this is really the last area that I would want to take care of. Just erase these out, and then your painting will be finished. A really nice professional look to it with the border, and then using mixed media. So we used the oil pastel and the watercolor, created a really nice effect. That's it.